Welcome to Old Testament History, Chapter 3, Session 2A, Biblical Chronology 101. Chronology is the backbone of history. Without chronology, we may know of events, but we'll have no way of relating them to each other. Time is important to God. If it were not important, He would not have included chronological information in the Bible, but it's definitely there. In fact, the Bible's timeline is the most complete of all ancient societies. But historians and archaeologists are more apt to believe what was written on clay tablets than written in the Bible. This is because they view the Bible as a religious book, and therefore they think it presents a biased viewpoint. But actually, those clay tablets or stone monuments from which they trust their chronologies are often more biased than one might think. In fact, they're more biased than the Bible could be, because the Bible tells things like they are. Even if the king was wrong, it would tell it like it was. But the court scribes that made those clay tablets often couldn't dare write the truth. They often had to spin the facts to present the current regime in good light. Does that sound familiar? Well, Satan is the god of this world, and so what else would you expect? What we're going to do with our chronology teaching, our strategy, is we're going to go through the basics, and then we're going to count forward from Adam till the kingdom of David, ultimately. Not all tonight. But then once we get to the kingdom of David, Remanetti's been working the kingdoms a bunch, and we will establish a fixed date in BC years, and then we'll work backward and apply BC dates to all the rest of the stuff in the Old Testament. But in order to process Hebrew timekeeping, we're going to have to learn how to count all over again. And you just can't count or think like a modern person with this subject. We're going to have to learn how they did it. Of course, the beginning of all of this was in Genesis 1:14. Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days, and for years." So God thought it important enough to set these up to aid us in our timekeeping. Ancient people divided the year up into seasons, and seasons were subdivided up into basically agricultural and weather stages, like the monsoon season, dry season, or plowing time, or planting time, or harvest time. Agriculture was something that almost everyone back then was involved in, because they grew their own food and stored it, and so they coordinated everything with the constellations and with the stars, especially something called the heliacal rising of stars. Now, heliacal comes from Helios, the sun, so I need to explain that. When I was teaching about the stars in chapter 2, I put you all in an imaginary room with all the stars painted on the walls and floor and ceiling, and you were the earth, and you were orbiting the sun. You remember that? Now, so I'm going to put you back in that room, except if you're driving your car and listening to this on your iPad that's plugged into the USB port on your car radio. So if you're driving in a car, don't try to imagine this. But if you're at home, go ahead and place an empty chair, kitchen chair or something, in the middle of the room, right? Go ahead and do that. Just put a chair out there into the middle of the room. And then the top or the back of that chair, imagine that that's where the sun is. Okay? At the back of that chair in the middle of the room. Now what I want you to do, we're going to simulate a sunrise. Go ahead and look away from the sun, that chair in the middle of the room, and then slowly turn your head until you see the chair back that represents the sun in the corner of your eye. All right? Well, you just simulated a sunrise. Now, what's on the wall on the opposite side of the room, directly in line with that chair that represents the sun? What's on the wall back there? Well, that would represent the portion of the sky that gets hidden by the sunrise that morning. There's going to be stars in that portion of the sky, and they will fade out of sight as the sun comes up. That is the heliacal rising. Because if we move forward a few feet in the room and do that all over again and simulate the sunrise, okay, you'll see the sun in the corner of your eye again, but there'll be a different part of the wall in the room in line with that, with the back of the chair as you look at it, right? And that represents there will be different stars there that would have faded out as you continue to turn and simulate a sunrise. So if you went all around the room and repeated that process, you don't have to do that, but if you went all around the room and simulated sunrises, the portion of the wall in the room in line with the chair, each time you look at it, would form a line around the room. That represents the ecliptic. Now, the only difference between that and how things really are when we are on the Earth is that the Earth is tilted on its axis. So that imaginary line around the room, if it's in reality, it wouldn't be flat, it would be tilted because the axis of the Earth is tilted. Okay? So, as the Earth goes around the sun, the stars in line with the sun each rise, and that is a heliacal rising. That marks a time of the year. Could be for a constellation too, when certain constellations come up, what month that is. That's a calendar. Ancient people knew a lot more about the stars than most of us because the stars were their calendar. Throughout the year, there would be different stars and familiar constellations that were in the background that would fade out of sight as the sun arose. At other times of the year at sunrise, those stars or constellations would still be below the horizon. But then when it was their time, they would be there at sunrise. They would have their heliacal rising. That was their calendar. In other words, like when the Pleiades stars did their heliacal rising, that marked the natural beginning of the agricultural year on the morning of the summer solstice. Ancient people were concerned about their pedigree also, and so they memorized their genealogies, and that's why Melchizedek was so unusual, because he was a famous orphan of whom his genealogy was unknown. And king's years were kept track of for historical purposes and bragging rights, and so that's how the antediluvian lineage of the patriarchs was preserved, because Noah knew his lineage, and then that was passed down orally all the way through Abraham, and then later written in the book of Genesis by Moses. Now, Superimposed on all of this was a monthly schedule. In almost every language, the word for month is related to the word for moon. Then the day was divided up into 12 hours. John 11:9 says, "Are there not 12 hours in the day?" But since the day is longer in the summer and shorter in the winter, the length of those hours varied. So the time of day was roughly determined by the sun's position, or if they had a sundial in their city in the marketplace. So the third hour was 9 a.m., the sixth hour was noon, the ninth hour was 3 p.m. The Hebrew day also was reckoned beginning at sunset. Genesis 1 says over and over again, and the evening and the morning were the first day, or evening and morning were the second day, and evening and morning were the third day. But was that when the sun touched the horizon, or when it fell below it? And what if there were mountains to the west? Because that would make a difference. Now, most days might not matter exactly when the sunset was accounted, except the Sabbath day. That was different, because they blew a trumpet from the Temple Mount Friday evening at sunset, and all work had to stop right then. So they wanted to make sure they were accurate with that time. Because, people are working on stuff. They think, well, gee, if I knew when sunset was going to be, then I might have 15 more minutes, So when did the day begin? Well, technically speaking, it actually began a little bit after sunset, when the first stars appeared. That would be independent of any mountain to the west. Nehemiah 4:21 talks about they worked until from the rising of the morning till the stars appeared. Till the stars appeared. That was the opposite of the morning. That was the evening. In the Old Testament, there were 3 watches of the night, beginning sunset till 10 p.m., and then the middle watch was 10 p.m. till 2 a.m., and the morning watch was the remainder of the night. In the New Testament, the night was divided up into 4 watches because of Roman influence. They changed the guard then. You had the first watch, the even watch, that began at evening. The second watch was 9 p.m. till midnight. The third watch was midnight till 3 a.m. That was called the cock crowing watch. Okay? And then the fourth watch was called shut up, chicken, or I'm going to wring your neck watch. Now, from 3 a.m. and on, that was the morning watch. The 7-day week probably goes all the way back to the beginning. But archaeological evidence does not emerge until the Babylonians, where they can prove that it existed, but we believe it went all the way back. And the Sabbath was celebrated on Saturday. Just a little bit of information about the months and things. The Hebrew months were lunar. Every month began at the first crack of the new moon. And so the months were alternating 29 and 30 days. The month names were Nisan or Abib, Iyar. By the way, I'm going to write some of this stuff up for you to have for a handout when we do the playback, all right? So you can relax and enjoy this. Iyar was the second month, or Ziph. Sivan, Tammuz, Ab, A-B, Elul. Then the seventh month was Tishri, or Ethanim. And then Marshesvan, or Bull. The 9th month was Kislev. 10th was Tebeth. 11th was Shebat. And the 12th month was Adar. So now if you have 12 months alternating 29 and 30 days, that gives a year of 354 days. Well, that's 11 and a quarter days too short, isn't it? 365 and a quarter is the length of a year now. So every 3 years or so, they'd have to have a 13th month. And they called the 13th month second Adar. But every 3 years, all right? Well, 3 times 11 and a quarter, because that's the difference between the lunar year of 12 months alternating 29, 30 days, and 365 and a quarter. So 3 times 11 and a quarter is 33 and 3/4. So an extra month would have to be thrown in to take care of 30 days of that 33 and a quarter. But then, so there'd be a second Adar that was not every 3 years. It might come every 2 years. And then, when that happened, but there were still 3 more days not accounted for. So that they would accumulate. So they had this schedule that they would have a 13th month every 2 or 3 years to keep things straight. And now, the reason they had to keep things straight is because all the feasts were coordinated with the calendar. And, the month began when the new moon was in the first of the month, and then when the moon was full on the 15th of the month, that was when many of the feast days were. I think Ren's going to talk more about that. So the barley harvest had to be ripe enough to do a special first fruits wave offering during Passover week. And that's what controlled when second Adars occurred. Because the barley had to be ripe enough to do that special offering. So the high priest would send his agricultural expert out into the fields during the 12th month, Adar. And if the barley was not going to be ripe enough for that wave offering in mid-Nisan on the 15th or after the 15th, during Passover week, the high priest would declare, ta-da! It's second Adar time. Ta-ra-ra boom die. It's second Adar time. Just listen for the chime. Oh, wait a minute. They didn't use a chime. They used bonfire signals. That worked well enough for a small country like Israel. But those bad old Samaritans, they sent mixed messages. They set off bonfires at different times to try to screw things up. Well, that's how they communicated. It's second Adar time. That's when the barley harvest wasn't going to be ripe enough, and so the high priest had to declare, well, we got an extra month. So that's what controlled the schedule of when those leap months basically were. So anyway, the year of Jesus' ministry was a year in which there was a second Adar. That's remarkable. There is a book that you can download for free from archive.org that's written by Parker and Dubberstein, Dubberstein, Parker and Dubberstein. If you look that up on archive.org, you'll find it. And it's got tables in it for all of the years going all the way back into antiquity. And they say when the second Adars were, when the leap months were. So, turns out that the year that Jesus' ministry was had a 13th month. So, now, there's something called a metonic cycle. That's a 19-year cycle. And if you have 19 years, 365 and a quarter, and 19 lunar years, alternating 29 30-day months, and years that had 13th months occasionally, if you had 19 of those lunar years and 7 of them scattered throughout that 19-year cycle were years that had a second Adar in them, then it would end up matching. It would match after 19 years. It's called a metonic cycle. So one way of counting 365 times 19, and the other way of counting the lunar months and throwing in the extra second Adars when needed, 7 of them throughout that 19 years, they would come to a spot in space around the sun that would be the same spot every 19 years. The 2 calendars would be in sync. That's interesting. Now, the Babylonians had a lunar calendar, and many of the names of the Hebrew months today are the Babylonian names. And they were influenced that much during the Babylonian captivity that the Jews adopted those Babylonian names. Well, unfortunately, many of the Babylonian month names are named after pagan gods, like Tammuz, just like many of our months and day names today are named after pagan gods. One of the most ancient calendars, if not the most, was noted in Genesis, where they had 30-day months and a 360-day year. We talked about in an earlier session how the flood somehow altered the length of a year from 360 days to 365 and a quarter. Now, we get that information about the 360-day year from Genesis 7 and Genesis 8. If you want to take a look, Genesis 7 verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So, the 2nd month, whatever that month was back then, the 2nd month, on the 17th day was when the flood started. All right? So then, later on, in Genesis 8:3, it says, the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated, and the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. So you have something from the 2nd month, 17th day, through the 7th month, 17th day, that were 150 days. Well, that's 5 months, 150 days. That's got to be 30-day months, right? That's interesting. So that was the original calendar, but I believe that after the flood, it had altered the length of the year. We talked about what could have done that in that session. So what's interesting, though, is after the flood, Egypt held on to a 360-day year. I think Greece did too, and then added a 5-day festival at the end of each year. I wonder what they did for those 5 days. They probably were crazy. But anyway, they added that 5-day festival, but it's 365 and a quarter, isn't it? That's the length of our year. So the Egyptians failed to account for the quarter day. Now, how could that be? I mean, the Egyptians were really smart, but after the flood, a lot of knowledge was lost. And so when Ham moved back down into that area and the Egyptians started proliferating again and all of that, they didn't calculate everything right. And so they lost a quarter day every year because they had 365 and not the quarter. So every 4 years, they would lose a day. And if that kept going, every 120 years, they would lose a month. And every 1,460 years, 365 times 4, they would lose a whole year. That 1,460 years is called a Sothic cycle. Well, that'd be crazy. I mean, you could really get away with putting out the Christmas decorations early because everybody was so confused. I mean, today we're miffed when we see Christmas stuff being put out before Halloween. Yeah. Well, imagine how confused the Egyptians were. Speaking of Halloween, I think they should combine Halloween and Election Day because they're so similar. Because both politicians and the Halloween partiers wear masks to hide their true identity. Except the politicians say the other guy is scarier. But they're both trick-or-treating for sure. Now, rumor has it that one party has cornered the dead folks vote, although both parties accuse each other of cornering the zombie vote. Well, I say, why wake up the dead folks for Halloween and then have them get up a few days later and make them vote? I mean, if we just combined them, it'd be a lot easier for those poor dead folks to vote. I mean, it's gross enough when those zombies leave their fingers in the voting booth. Oh, sorry. Oh, well, I better shut up. Get back on the subject. The Greeks had a lunar calendar, but they also had a 4-year divisions called Olympiads. They held the Olympic Games every 4 years. Paul wrote Corinthians during an Olympiad year. It's interesting. Now, the Jews had 2 years, a sacred year and a civil year. Ren's going to talk about that more. Sacred year begin with Nisan, civil year begin 6 months later in Tishri. Well, that's just like our fiscal year begins in July and our civil year begins in January. Now, our calendar is not lunar. It's called the Julian calendar after Julius Caesar. And it had a 365 and a quarter day year, but a 365 day year with a leap year, take care of the quarter, every 4 years. But that actually is not exact enough. So Pope Gregory decreed there be a slight change in that schedule, and that is if a leap year falls on a centennial year, then it won't be a leap year, except if that centennial year is exactly divisible by 400. So in other words, in our modern era, 1800 and 1900 were not leap years. But the year 2000 was. This change was adopted by half of Europe in 1582, and an adjustment was made on Thursday, October the 4th, 1582. And then the next day was Friday, October the 15th. So it jumped from the 4th to the 15th to adjust for all the days that had been lost by the not having the leap years right. Now, that was for the Catholics. They went with the Pope, but the Protestants balked at that at first, saying that blankety-blank Pope has stolen 10 days from us. But they slowly came around. So now we are all on the what's called the Gregorian calendar. All right? But now, this is where we have to make a clean break and not think like modern folks. They counted their own way, and it's not quite the way that we do. We have cardinal and ordinal numbers. Cardinal tell how many of things. Ordinal tell sequence. So cardinal numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4. Ordinal numbers are first, second, third, fourth. Sometimes you have to think twice to keep them straight. Like, the 18th century was the 1700s. The 19th century was the 1800s. The 20th century was the 1900s. So now we are in the 21st century. We count certain things with cardinal numbers and certain things with ordinal numbers. We're used to it. And we instinctively know which to use. Well, ancient people use cardinal, ordinal numbers different than we do, but they were used to how they used them. For example, people's ages. We don't say a baby is 1 year old till after their first birthday. Before their first birthday, we count months. But, believe it or not, in the Bible, they were said to be 1 year old in their first year. Now, how do I know that? Remember, Herod had all the children 2 years old and under killed to try to get Jesus, right? Remember that? Well, that order was not issued right after he was born, when he was an infant, because the wise men hadn't showed up then. That situation arose when those wise men showed up in Jerusalem and asked, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" Now, that was the most politically incorrect question to ask at that time, because that evil Herod was sick and all the Jews were waiting for him to croak, and he knew it. Remember, he diligently asked the wise men, "When did the star appear?" And then he pressed the priests for details, and they said, "Oh, yeah, it's somewhere in the world. Oh, yeah, the prophecy says it's in Bethlehem." Then, remember, when the wise men went to see Mary and Jesus in Bethlehem, it wasn't in a manger, it was in a house. And Jesus wasn't an infant, he was a toddler. Completely different Greek words are used there for infant and toddler. And Joseph was not even mentioned with the wise men when they were there. Now, the astronomy for what the wise men saw when they went south towards Bethlehem from Jerusalem was actually 15 months after Rosh Hashanah and 3 BC when Jesus was born. So Jesus was 15 months old that December when the wise men showed up, probably right at the winter solstice. I mentioned what that meant in my book, Happy Belated Birthday, Jesus, when they saw the star, that it came and stood over where the young child was. Well, that term stood applies because Jupiter went into retrograde motion again in 2 BC, just like it had done in that triple conjunction with Regulus in 3 BC. And when Jupiter starts that, there's a 6-day period in which it stands. It stands still against the backdrop of the stars on the ecliptic. And that was in the winter solstice in 2 BC. So, when Jesus was in his second year in 2 BC is when they showed up. All right, but since they said a child was 1 year old during his first year, then they say the child is 2 during their second year, right? So that is why Herod killed all the babies 2 years old and under when the wise men didn't show up and tell him where he was. But Jesus and Mary and Joseph had been warned by an angel and left town the same night the wise men had appeared. So Herod could not swoop down in time to catch them. So that's interesting, isn't it? There's also another account, and I think I'll just keep this to save some time. I'm going to reproduce it in the paper I give you, because this is from Walter Cummins' book, The Acceptable Year of the Lord. And on page 37 and 38, where he uses this same system to count the chronological information that's given in Luke chapter 3. The 15th year of Tiberius equals the about 30 year of Jesus. And if you count the squares, if you count by our method of counting, it does not line up. But if you count by their method of counting, where he was thought of being 1 year old during his first year, then he is 29 during the 15th year of Tiberius, and all of that information in Luke chapter 3 lines up. Very interesting. So, now, I just want to talk to you a little bit about a few other things before we take a break. So, the Jews also had something called sabbatical years. These are mentioned in Leviticus 25. Sabbatical years were every 7 years. All right. Look at Leviticus 25. And the Lord spoke to Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord." So this didn't start in the wilderness. It started when they got into the land. 6 years thou shalt sow your field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. That which grows of its own accord of thy harvest thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed, for it is a year of rest unto the land. And the Sabbath of the land shall be meat for you, for thee, and for thy servant, for thy maid, for thy hired servant, for thy stranger that sojourns with thee, for your cattle, for the beasts that are in thy land, shall all the increase thereof be meat. Now, this is very important to understand, because remember the Dust Bowl? Where did the Dust Bowl in the 30s start? In the West, in the desert land. You know, desert land has to be managed carefully because it's vulnerable. And the agriculture that was used on the desert land in the West was mismanaged. God knows how to manage land. And so he told the children of Israel, because much of their land was also the same kind of land that was out west. And he said to them, you have to let that land rest every 7 years and go fallow. You know what a fallow field is, right? Sometimes if you're out in the country, you'll see a field that doesn't have any crops growing in it that year. But the next year it does. So they let the land grow fallow. It helps, because otherwise you could wear it out. And that's what happened during the Dust Bowl. So God says, look, you have to let the land rest every 7 years. Now look at Leviticus 25, verse 20. And so the people said, well, if you say, well, what are we going to eat that 7th year? We are not going to sow nor gather in our increase. So what are we going to eat? Look at this, verse 21. God says, I will command my blessing upon you in the 6th year, and it shall bring forth fruit for 3 years. So 7th year is the fallow year. And you shall sow the 8th year and eat of old fruit until the 9th year, until her fruits come in, and you shall eat of the old store. Now, I'm going to give you a chart, and you'll see how this works. Because the 6th year, these are Nisan to Nisan years. And so the 6th year is there's last year that they sow, and then they reap in the 7th year. But the second half of the 7th year and the first half of the 8th year in Nisan years is the sabbatical, and that's measured by Tishri to Tishri years. I'll show it to you in the chart. And then they sow from Tishri to Nisan in the 8th year, and then they reap after Nisan in the 9th year. So that is how the sabbatical works every 7th year. Then they also have something called the Jubilee year. And the Jubilee year is every 7 Sabbath years. Okay? So that's in Leviticus 25:8. It says, "Thou shalt number the 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto you 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound in the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement you shall make the trumpet sound throughout all your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land." So this occurs in the 7th month. And they say, ta-da, it's the Jubilee. And during this Jubilee, every man shall return to his possession, and every man to his family. Because what they did is they had something to provide for bankruptcy, if that ever happens to someone, when calamity occurs and they have to sell themselves into slavery to pay for something, or they have to sell their land to pay for something. Then what God set up is every Jubilee, every 49 years, they would have, ta-da, everybody can go back to their possession. So they would get their old land back. So that old land, when they sold it to pay off their debt, it was not paid off permanently. The land was not sold permanently. It was only sold until the next Jubilee year. So the price was prorated. That's discussed later, but we'll talk about that in a different session. But anyway, verse 11, "A Jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. You shall not sow nor reap that which grows of itself in it, nor gather the grapes in it of thy vine undressed." Well, it just so happens that 50th year, it began in Tishri. They blew the trumpet right then in Tishri in the 7th month. So the regular numbering of the years is Nisan to Nisan years, and then that last sabbatical year behaves just like a sabbatical year. The last sabbatical year, the 7th one, is also the Jubilee one that goes from Tishri to Tishri. That's the 50th year, how it's counted. So I'll show that to you in a diagram. It's a lot easier when you listen to the playback if you've got that and you're looking at it. I was just so busy this week and not feeling well from that COVID shot I got. I just got behind, and hope you excuse me for that. So anyway, we just have a few minutes. I want to run through one more thing here. I want to apply what we've learned so far. And I'm going slow just to not be confusing to you. I hope you don't mind that. But anyway, here's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. I'm going to start at Adam, use all the information in the genealogies in the Christ line. So-and-so lived so many years, begat so-and-so. And this is one place where one gets to prove all these assumptions that we've made about chronology. Now, I did the bulk of my chronology research way back in 1977 through 1983, or 85 actually. And I charted it all out on graph paper because I had to count the squares. It was so difficult for me. I had to count those squares, and I wrote everything in pencil because I had to erase stuff all the time when I found out I was wrong. But, numbers don't lie. The numbers are pretty straightforward. But here's a funny thing. Since I got so involved in so many other research projects, and this research was so long ago, that when it came time to get back into it for this class, Old Testament history, I realized I'd forgotten some stuff. So, I had to get going again with my graph paper charts. And I immediately realized I had a problem. There have been many chronologers who have written about books on the subject of chronology. James Ussher wrote the Annals of the Old Testament. Jacob Anstey wrote The Romance of Biblical Chronology. He must have loved numbers or something. Other scholars like Isaac Newton or Johannes Kepler wrote chronologies. E.W. Bullinger has one in the Companion Bible. So when I did my research, I looked at their work and then did mine. Well, when I originally did my charts for the graph paper, I followed their lead in how they handled the ages of people in Genesis. So when they were born and counted the years and all that stuff, well, these last few weeks that I've had to revisit the chronology, I'm approaching my work with a different mindset. It's based on all the things I've learned, and I bring new tools such as the signpost words and repetitions. So guess what? I ran into a roadblock immediately because remember I said that when they counted people's ages, they counted them ordinally. The first year of a child was also 1 year old. We saw that in the age of Jesus in Luke 3 and Matthew 2. But all those chronologers handled ages differently. What a headache. But there was one more factor when it comes to chronology, and that's calendaring. That's culture. And sometimes culture changes. Red Minetti jumped into the chronology pool and learned how to swim. He's done pretty good. And he's gone through this too. And it's a good thing he's a free thinker like I am, because this draws out stuff, and he and I have been in discussions about chronology, and I've had to rethink stuff because Ren has suggested better things. And there's still some stuff that's up in the air that we hope to resolve. But I'm grateful for Ren because he's keeping my feet to the fire to make sure we're on the word. What does the word actually say? So anyway, when it comes to the ages of people, it looked like how they counted changed culturally, somewhere in between the Old Testament and the New. A lot of things did change then, such as people primarily speaking Aramaic after the Babylonian captivity, or with the calendar using the pagan Babylonian month names. So there's precedent for that change. So anyway, I recalculated my chart and graph squares, and I was counting the ages like they counted it in Luke 3 and Matthew 2, instead of the way that all the other chronologers counted them. So I was coming up with different numbers than I originally come up with. I figured that sooner or later I'd run into a situation that would prove which one was right, whether they were one at the first year or whether they were one during the second year, all right, like we count. So which way was right? The way that Isaac Newton counted, or Jacob Usher, or Bullinger, or was it the way that it was in Luke chapter 3? So Genesis 5 is the first genealogy. Then it says that Adam lived 130 years and begat a son. Well, what does begat mean? Was that when the son was conceived in his 130th year? Or was he born in his 130th year? All right. Then Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos. Well, now, if I counted that ordinally, like in the New Testament, Luke 3, if I counted it that way, well, all the other chronologers counted it different. And so I would end up 1 year earlier for when Enos was born than the chronologers. Because if I counted that ordinarily, like in the New Testament, then when Enos was born, it was Adam's 130th year. But that year would be counted twice, once as Adam's 130th year and once as Seth's first year. The other chronologers didn't count it that way. They counted Seth's first year as Adam's 131st. That's what we normally do in our modern culture. So which one's right? I mean, Red and I are rethinking all this stuff. There's nothing sacred except the Word. So, I mean, he and I may come up with stuff that's different. Well, I'm okay with that. So anyway, if you carry all that method all the way through and count it one way like the other chronologers counted, or count it like Luke 3 counted, you would lose 1 year at each begat. Because those years were counted twice, once as that year of the person, the father, and as the first year of the child. So you'd end up 18 years different for when Terah died and Abram left Haran. But right during then is where there are enough other numbers given that we can solve the problem of which type of counting they used for the ages of the patriarchs, because it says Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. It also says he was 10 years in the land when Sarah gave him Hagar to be his wife. Well, Ishmael was conceived and born the next year. And then it says Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised. And it also says Abram was 99 when he was circumcised, because they were both circumcised the same day. So, voila! Now, somebody said I'm mispronouncing that, so I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. I'm sorry, it's your pet peeve. I don't know how to say it right. But voila! Sorry. There are enough numbers there that we can prove that the chronologer's method of counting was right. So they did not count ages inclusively and double counted the begat years. They did not do that. So that chart that you have that I had handed out before with the ages, the longevity chart, that's accurate with the ages. And so it puts the flood at 1656 in Anno Homini years, the years of man, the years since Adam. So the chronologers counted it right, and then somehow the way that ages were kept track of changed, probably during the Babylonian captivity. The cultures were imposed upon the Jews, and so then by the time in the New Testament, when they counted ages, they counted it different. So anyway, you get up to the flood in 1656. So I think that's all we're going to do in this session. So I want you to take a break, and then Ren's going to teach us some things about chronology that he has developed as well. So, bless you.